Welcome to Sir John Soane's Museum, both those of you who are here in the building and those of you who are watching digitally. My name is Bruce Boucher, I'm the director, and we're delighted to be able to host this year's Soane Medal Lecture in the library dining room of the home of Sir John Soane, now the Soane Museum. There have been Soane lectures in the past, but when we reformulated the concept as a Soane Medal Lecture in 2017, the idea was to celebrate the achievements of a person either as architect, educator, or critical thinker whose work has had a profound impact upon architecture and culture and society. And I'd like to pay tribute to our distinguished former trustee, Sir David Chipperfield, who really spearheaded this project of reinventing and reinvigorating the Soane Lecture as the Soane Medal Lecture. And I'd also like to acknowledge that the program wouldn't be possible without the support of the Rolex Institute, for which we are all immensely grateful, especially as they have enabled us to bring our distinguished winner to London for this evening's celebration. Tonight's recipient has focused her practice on designing buildings in tune with their natural environment, while embracing the design challenges of sustainability and our collective impact on the planet. She's not only a highly distinguished and lauded architect, but also a dedicated teacher and a champion of the communities she serves. She describes herself modestly, or her career, as a work in progress. That may be so, but she has already achieved a great deal. In fact, this summer, the New York Times singled out one of her buildings as among the most influential 25 buildings of the past 50 years. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege and pleasure to present the 2021 Soane Medal to Marina Tabassum. Marina.
Just give it to Lewis. Well, thank you, Bruce. It's an absolute honor for me to be here and to receive this enormous honor. So really, thank you so much. It's a beautiful atmosphere, actually, to be here. I've been here before as a visitor. Never thought that I would be standing here today receiving this honor and to be here to speak about my journey in architecture. So, so there is a little booklet, so I'm going to be reading from that, basically. It's about my journey in architecture, and so it will be pretty much starting from my formative years to the way I practice architecture. So if we have the presentation. So architecture, my journey. I'm 52 years old. Unlike the giants who preceded me to this lectern, I consider myself a work in progress. The search is still on. The anxiousness of many years have evaporated with my turning 50. Choices made, roads taken, all leading me to a point of no return. This is not a time to reminisce on the past that could slow me down. This is the time to pour out all that was gathered over time, through relentless search, to contribute to the pursuit of architecture. This is not time yet to look back and pick up the pieces to tell my tale. All the stories and encounters are being gathered and archived in my memory for the time in the future. Someday, when I'm sitting at the porch of my farmhouse, which I'm yet to build, up in the north in Rohanpur, across the mango orchard looking into the horizon as far as I can see, reminiscing the days gone by, I could then go back to the earliest memory of my life, the sounds of destruction of the Liberation War in 1971. My story begins there, with my 2-year-old self holding on to the sadness of my grandfather's passing in the middle of the war. watching from my grandparents' house in Shantinagar as the police barrack in Rajarbagh blazed with fire. The sirens and subsequent blackouts of air raid are still unsettling memories. My introduction to death and destruction came before my enrollment in elementary school. Growing up in the 70s in a war-ravaged, fledgling nation of 70 million, full of uncertainties and minimum means, children of my generation matured somewhat faster than usual. There were no toys to play with. We invented our own. We invented the games we played. My childhood self witnessed a country in famine in 1974. Children of opulence will never know the power of imagination that can turn a rice ball into a boiled egg. I realized very early in life that limited means cannot limit hopes and dreams. Instead, it opens the window of innovation, a lesson from my modest upbringing that informs my work thus far. I grew up in a 3-room house with a long veranda and a courtyard surrounded by tall mango trees. There was no particular function assigned to each room. They were multi-purpose. One room might serve as dining area by day, and by night it would become a bedroom. The room where friends and families would gather transformed into another bedroom. The veranda opened up to a courtyard where most of our days were spent. In this fluidity, a household of 4 children coexisted rather well. We learned to accommodate, to negotiate, to appropriate. My father would say those were the most important values in life. The walls had 2 sides. On one side was my grandparents' property, a 2-story courtyard house secured with high walls. On the other side of the wall was the rickshaw puller's slum. Life of a child was dictated by which side of the wall she was born. On one side there was privilege, opportunity, aspiration, and on the other, struggle, and more struggle. We children played together in the field, unaware of the differences between us and how our beginning would in turn impact our futures. They didn't go to school, we did. I was aware of the privilege we were born into. Unlike many, my family had the means to provide my siblings and me with good education and opportunities of growth. I grew up in an environment where there was no discrimination between boy and girl. Even more fortunate, my parents instilled in us the importance and values of giving. My father, being the only doctor in the neighborhood, each morning would wake up to a long line of patients from the neighboring slum. He would attend to each one of them before setting off to work. In many ways, I seek that relevance through architecture by expanding the agency beyond architectural program, moving past the site boundary to address the human condition and the local ecology of sustenance. In this pursuit, I'm trying to establish a sense of social and environmental responsibility that transcends architecture's quintessential agenda of space and form. Both my grandparents were immigrants. Their life in Dhaka began after the partition of the subcontinent in 1947. They were residents of Malda, a district now part of West Bengal. My father was 10 years old when his family left home in the middle of a Hindu-Muslim riot. A base of a hookah intricately inlaid with silver is the only physical memory that connects him to his home in Malda. He never found closure. He longed to go back home. But even though the nightmare of the partition would end, there was no going back to what was lost. Home became a longing, a story he would tell his children and grandchildren. We, the 3rd generation of an immigrant family, grew up with stories and mental construct of a lost home that exists only in our imaginations. Being born and brought up in a city of Dhaka, my connection to villages were few and far between. The eternal beauty of the Delta land revealed herself to me only in the last decade through various projects in the Ganges Delta. I found my desh there through the interaction and connections I felt with rural Bengal, the soul of the Delta land. There is inherent wisdom embedded in living symbiotically with nature. Their dwellings do not aspire to be different from their neighbors. Values are rooted in homogeneity and communal way of life. In a family of technocrats, it is taken for granted that one would either become a doctor or an engineer. But I had a mind that sought freedom and could not be tamed by convention. My parents knew me well. My father suggested, why not architecture? In the late 80s, there was only one school, Bangladesh University of Engineering Technology, that offered architecture courses to 50 students in a country of 12 million. The admission was tough, and one had to sit for an exam. In light of this statistical unlikelihood, an architecture student was appointed to impart the basic knowledge of design and composition that I might go on to study. I felt an immediate connection to architecture, a sense of discovery and freedom that turned into a strong determination, a journey that began for me in 1989. Even in the 80s, the profession of architecture was fairly new in Bangladesh and was still struggling to establish a place in an engineer-dominated construction industry. The architecture school was set up in 1962 with a grant from Ford Foundation. Richard Vrooman, a professor from Texas A&M University, was the first dean. The curriculum that was set up in the 60s continued in the late 80s, a heavy dose of modernism at a time when the postmodern movement had taken root in the West. We students learned to dislike ornament and adore form-finished concrete. In a pre-internet era, our only window to the world beyond Bangladesh was through the book in the university library. We dutifully spent long hours admiring works of modern architecture masters of the 20th century. I particularly enjoyed a book on Louis Barragan that instilled in me a longing to visit Mexico. But the book I repeatedly returned to for inspiration was a volume on the New York Five. These maverick architects and their buildings were as exciting to me as Coca-Cola. My biggest takeaway from school was the backpacking trips I took with friends through the subcontinent, from Ojunta to Ellora to Fatehpur Sikri, my peers and I exploring the richness of our own architectural history. Those of us who grew up outside of the West, yet with every aspect of our upbringing influenced by Western thinking, grew up quite confused. Self-esteem was low growing up in a country ravaged by war and poverty and challenged climatically and politically. Few talked about patriotism while growing up in the 80s. Some of us learned to reject our own context and aspired for a life in the West. Many of my peers responded to the calling and left for good. There were also a few among us who aspired to retain cultural integrity by embracing localness. I'm a firm believer in mediation and sought balance through negotiation. I sought to root myself as much as I aspired to explore. The Parliament complex of Louis Khan is a much revered building in Bangladesh, and it was ritualistic for architecture students to visit the complex with our professors. The ambulatory of the is an urban street that connects 8 building blocks to the central chamber. The street is a room lit by sunlight filtering through the glass bricks embedded in the roof. The brightness of the direct sun filtering through the ceiling reveals the dramatic play of light and shadow. As the clouds cover the sun, the light inside the ambulatory softens, giving way to the somber mood. How the atmosphere inside a building, in this building, could change with the movement of sun and cloud was my first lesson in daylight. The magic and harnessed power of light that I first experienced in the ambulatory of the Parliament building became a relentless search for the spirit of architecture, a spirit that is an extension of us. A building is a being that enters into silent dialogue with the dwellers. Together they create memories, share stories, shaping and aging together. At times, a building can teach us more about architecture than schools can. The Parliament building of Bangladesh is one such building. When I graduated from architecture school in 1995, the affliction of consumer architecture had already infested the city of Dhaka. Architecture practices based in Bangladesh, as elsewhere in the world, were busy designing multi-tiered residential commercial blocks ready for sale. A generation of fast-breed buildings primarily focused on profitability sprung up in the blink of an eye. The first confrontation in professional life surfaced with the commodification of architecture, as I witnessed the global tendency towards instant gratification and industrially produced anthropogenic materials devised to standardize the entire globe. The perennial quest for identity that was a struggle since childhood seemed more diluted with high-flying capitalist culture. the icon mania of the super-rich, the stardom of architects, brought about a crisis. It's a point of crisis where an architect must decide whether to indulge in this excitement or to choose a path of resistance. I chose to resist, to deny temptation, and to search within the land I grew up in, a place I call home, the fragile delta where no one knows where water ends and land begins, a magical chemistry embedded in the psyche of the local people, their life and living. The abundance of rain is a blessing in the monsoon season, while the dry days of winter are quiet breaks. The earth is generous, vegetation lush, and history rich. The spirit of the delta offers insight into a unique material palette defined by climate, location, culture, and history. And yet the spirit of time draws attention to the evolutionary nature of socio-economic cultural atmosphere that is in constant flux. Mazharul Islam, the first Bengali architect of Bangladesh, my mentor and guide, stressed on rootedness in order to produce a contemporary work of architecture that is an offering to the matrix of people, place, time, and context. Arbana, my first partnership and practice, was formed with Kashif Chaudhry in November 1995. Our passion for architecture resulted in a deep friendship and belief in the craft, resulting in a decade-long partnership in both work and life. In 1997, 1.5 years after forming Arbana, we won the competition to design the Independence Monument and Museum of Independence of Bangladesh in Dhaka. Hard won and much awaited, we nonetheless understood the immense responsibility associated with the opportunity. The project demanded an investigation into contemplation and timelessness. The liberation of Bangladesh is a tale of duality. Independence gained through selfless sacrifice of a brutal war. Freedom has a preferred direction, upwards. Anything aspirational assumes an upward gait. And yet memory, loss, sadness urges the subterranean, a desire to be unearthed from the ground. We introduced a horizontal expanse parallel to the flatness of the park, a platform of celebration and hope defined by the Tower of Light. The history of revolution, struggle, and genocide gently tucked below grade in the museum beneath the plaza. The project that began with extreme positive vigor in 1998 finally found its completion 16 years later in 2013. In the subtropical humid climate of Bangladesh, architecture can essentially be a pavilion. A roof to cover from the elements and a plinth to keep us above the monsoon rain is adequate to create a primal hut. The Pavilion apartment, completed in 2001 as our residence, cemented many of the explorations around material and climate appropriateness. We attempted to blur the edges between inside and out, echoing the spirit of the place. The high volume of the nature court, combined with flexible shutters, created airflow that kept the spaces ventilated throughout the hot summer months. The project has addressed the basic methodology of reduction to redefine living in a 1,250 square feet of free-flowing space in the top floor of a contemporary urban dwelling. First step of planning was to strip clients' architectural program down to the essence of human activities in order to discard the complexity and extract the basic essence of living. This generated 4 major spaces: eating, sleeping, socializing, and being with nature. This project sought out ways of repurposing discarded materials handcrafted for a renewed life. 10 years in Arbana helped to craft my confidence so as to combat the inhibitions, intimidations, and fear of being a woman in a man's world. I spent long hours on site, at times staying up all night in the cold winter months during the trade shows to meet the deadlines. It's all in the attitude, knowing one's craft and fostering connection with the people who give life to our drawings. Unfortunately, our partnership in Arbana did not end in peace. I left the practice and gathered the self-assurance and vision to set out my solo journey in the pursuit of architecture. Marina Tabassum Architects, MTA, a studio-based practice, was set up in June 2005. It would be driven by my passion and belief in combining research, teaching, and practice to inform the outcome. I decided consciously to keep the office size at optimum operational level in order to select projects carefully and limit their numbers each year. A building must breathe without the help of artificial means. That is an obsession I confess I pursue quite earnestly in all projects. Porosity of the building skin, open courts, and long verandas are ingenious traditions from the pre-air conditioning era that are still valid in contemporary times. Investigations into contemporizing these techniques in order to reduce dependency on mechanical means resulted in several MTA projects. In 2005, around the time MTA was founded, one evening my grandmother, Sufia Khatun, invited me for tea. She had with her a map of the land she owned in the north of Dhaka. She offered to donate some part of it to build a mosque. It was her wish that I design and build her dream project. Since my grandfather's passing in 1971, she lived a very modest life as a widow in a white sari. The sudden demise of my mother, her eldest child, in 2002 put her in deep sense of loss. So too for me, this loss was perhaps the lowest and darkest point in my life to date. It was a moment of time when we both sought healing, and designing the mosque became our process. My grandmother passed away within a few months of the groundbreaking ceremony of Baitur Rauf Mosque in December 2006. The promise to realize her dream turned into a 6-year-long project where I was the architect, builder, fundraiser, and client. Baitur Rauf Mosque was the first commission of MTA and also the most revered around the world. Initial idea was to search for the essence of Islam devoid of ritualistic and symbolic attributes, to question what is a mosque. The first mosque of Islam was built under the directive of Prophet Muhammad. It was primarily a space of congregation of followers. In addition to communal prayer, the mosque housed social, administrative, and judicial events that helped establish the spread of doctrine of the religion. Clarity of space devoid of hierarchy is prerequisite. Instead of glorifying symbolic features such as domes and minaret, it felt right to focus on spirituality of the space that would heighten one's sense of being in communion with God. Light became the major element of design. Dhaka is one of the densest and fastest growing cities in the world, with some 20 million inhabitants. Due to the lack of decentralized policies, all roads of the country lead to Dhaka. The northern fringe of the city used to be farmland, which went through rapid transformation into residential settlements over the last 2 decades. In anticipation of a dense, unregulated neighborhood, the mosque offered order in chaos. The main prayer hall is designed as a place of refuge where everyone is welcomed. A pavilion on 8 columns wrapped in brick structure that houses the ancillary functions of the mosque. The perforated breathing wall and the open courts help to keep the building ventilated throughout the summer months. The local community, who are the main mosque attendees, helped the process of building by funding the construction in small amounts. This fostered a sense of communal ownership. The space, form, and material remain in their elemental state, light being the only ornament that glorifies the atmosphere, responds to the 6 seasons of Bangladesh. The building industry of Bangladesh relies on unskilled physical labor. Very few people can read construction drawings. Quite often, architectural instructions and designs are communicated with sketches, samples, or 3D renderings along with vigilance on site to avoid major errors in construction. This has allowed us to develop some long-standing relationship with highly skilled artisans. We learn to appreciate the beauty of imperfection of handcrafting. 90% of Bangladeshis have little or no familiarity with architects and architecture as a profession. Quite often, it requires familiarization through participatory processes in order to be inclusive and to develop a sense of ownership. One of our several projects in the Rohingya refugee camps in Ukhia focuses on building resilience through reforestation. The natural forests of Teknaf was ruptured by the influx of refugees from Myanmar in 2017 that resulted in rising temperature in summer and landslide during monsoon. Our project includes participatory workshops and community engagements with refugee communities to facilitate regeneration of the forest through various methods of planting. including seed bombs and bamboo nailing techniques. The activities are not only therapeutic, but also enable participants with the knowledge of and motivation to care for the environment. In Louis Kahn's words, architecture has no presence. Only a work of architecture has presence. And a work of architecture is presented as an offering to architecture. Architecture has no favorites. It has no preference for technology. It just sits there waiting for a work to indicate, again, to revive the spirit of architecture by its nature, from which people can live for many years. It is immensely liberating realizing that an architect is not bound by the four walls of a building, but can engage in broadening the agenda of architecture. One can transcend the visual dominance and object making towards an architecture of relevance in response to time's needs. Panigram Resort in Jessore is 150 kilometers to the north of Sundarbans, the largest mangrove forest in the world and home to the Royal Bengal tigers. Located in the southern side of the Podda River, the land was created by progradation of the Ganges estuary, by accumulation of silt. Highly fertile land of the mature delta is predominantly agrarian. My first visit to the site in 2013 revealed an innate beauty of living symbiotically with nature. The thought of invading this primal quietness of life with the roaring noise of architecture felt like a crime. Ironically, the villagers, especially the younger generation, are fascinated by the glitz of city life. For them, the city holds all the answers to the troubled question of a better life. As news of our project traveled through the village, they expected and were excited by the new Dhaka that was to be born in the remote village of Tahirpur. Instead, we visited their houses and inquired about the recipe of building with mud. We praised the women who maintained their mud houses so beautifully as if they were pieces of art. The village elders, whose knowledge had become obsolete, were suddenly the encyclopedia of information as we engaged in conversation. A courtyard, Utan as it's called, a lived space, is the soul of a Bengali household, physically not defined by any boundary, an ensemble of elements of daily life casually placed to give a sense of enclosure. Earth as its floor and sky as the ceiling, the room leaks from one court to another, creating a social atmosphere where every household is unique, yet with a deep sense of communal connectivity. It is a theatrical display of life lived with nature. Between dawn to dusk, the space changes character as the users move through daily ritual of livelihood. Empty as an installation at the 2018 Venice Biennale, Wisdom of the Land, was essentially a courtyard of a Bengali hut as a response to the curator's description of free space that went beyond the visual, choreographing the daily life. The Panigram project offered an opportunity to bring back the lost pride and belief in the wisdom of the land crafted over hundreds of years of dwelling in the Delta. We believe that creative thinking of our time needs to engage in reconnecting with the values of living meaningfully and symbiotically as a natural being. We opted for a minimally intrusive approach by including the villagers in the construction process, incorporating local knowledge of vernacular tradition. Through our engagement, we realized that keeping villagers in their location would require empowering them with opportunities, reviving the pride of craft, place and belonging. Reversing the trend of migration would require improvement of living condition, work opportunities, ensured facilities of health and education. A cooperative named Panigram Community Initiative was established to generate various activities and workshops to empower villagers that would eventually lead to economic prosperity. $2,000 Home Project is one such outcome of the Panigram Community Initiative, a co-creation model and education program initiated by MTA in collaboration with Community Architects Group, POCA, to enable villagers build a better living environment. The process began by encouraging villagers to save, contributing small amounts to a seed fund. Members of the savings group can apply each in turn for a loan up to $2,000 in order to finance a modular house to improve their living condition. This is a budget for a building of 2-bedroom and a bathroom. As architects, we listen to people's aspiration. They design their dream houses as they have done for generations. and we provide our technical knowledge and insight into space making. The process involves mutual respect and sharing. It is minimally intrusive to maximize the impact of architecture. Brick building tradition has strong roots in the Ganges Delta. Architecture of power, be it political, cultural, or religious, that sought permanence used brick. The Buddhist monasteries dating back to 3rd century BC were built with baked bricks. The Hindu temples showcase the finest of terracotta works depicting the mythologies of Ramayana and Mahabharata. In contrast, architecture of human dwellings, which frequently adapt to change and evolve, employ organic, impermanent, locally sourced materials. Impermanence is embedded into the dynamic nature of the Ganges Delta. Interplay of erosion and emergence is a unique phenomena that has shaped the lives of Bengalis dwelling in this fragile land in the confluence of 3 major rivers, Podda, Meghna, and Jamuna. There exists a duality of joy and untold torment each year to a large number of people living along the banks of the streams of Bangladesh. The water level rises during the monsoon season. Between June to October, the tributary streams carry excess water from the Himalayas, which inflate and expand the territory, causing the banks to erode and readjust. Along the Ganges-Brahmaputra basin, the houses are adapted to flat-pack system with wooden frame and corrugated metal sheets. In the wake of riverbank erosion, the locals disassemble their houses and move to a safer location. Houses move, villages move. In some cases, the entire town has shifted location. Some families have moved 3 to 4 times, while some have lost their means to start anew and move to the slums in the cities. We attempted to showcase some of these stories of complex existence and unending negotiation between human and nature as part of our presentation at the Sharjah Architecture Triennial in 2019. Through Inheriting Wetness, MTA's investigation into land ownership and precarious inheritance laws offered a closer look into human life affected by the transient geoformation accelerated by the effects of sea level rise. We bought 3 flat-pack houses from a local market in Doha and shipped to the venue. On an average, each house cost £1,500 and took 3 architects and a carpenter to put together in some 15 days on site. The combined flow of Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers form one of the 3 largest riverine sources of water and sediment of the ocean. The tidal dynamics of low current in the dry season forms sedimentation locally known as chor. For the landless, ultra-low-income people, chors offer some years of relief as they settle with families fishing and cultivating the land. A shack made from tall grass costs nothing but provides a roof overhead. Chors are not land. They belong to the river. The transitory nature of these tradable part of the river does not allow long-term planning. One must be ready with an exit plan in case the river overruns the chor. Bay of Bengal is a hotspot of climate insecurity, its ecosystem already affected by the accelerated sea level rise. The irony is that the people in the coastal area whose existence is in crisis have 0 carbon footprint. These coastal communities rationalize the harsh reality as God's will and keep adapting to the changing circumstances. We as a profession have responsibility towards them. Part of that responsibility is about bringing change to the building and construction industry that contribute to 50% of climate change. Architecture pedagogy needs to bring climate crisis in the forefront of education. In 2020, the office work at MTA slowed down during the first wave of COVID-19 pandemic. We dedicated the lull exploring the idea of a flat-pack modular house for the landless chor dwellers. That resulted in Khudibari, a lightweight modular space frame structure with bamboo and steel joints, easy to assemble and disassemble. A 3-meter module of Khudibari costs £300 and can house a family of 4. To date, we have housed 4 families in Chor Hijla in order to understand the natural responses of local people. We are in the process of housing 100 families by June 2023. Architects of 21st century must address the imbalance in our environment created by extraction, overproduction, and exploitation of resources that has put our existence in crisis. Architecture can transform the stockpile of waste into potential building material with collaborative research. Architecture can resolve pride in the age-old wisdom of living symbiotically with nature. Architecture can empower communities to secure better life and living condition. And I firmly believe all this can be achieved without sacrificing the innate objective of space and placemaking. Every site has a story. Architecture adds to the narrative of building upon these ingredients sought out from these stories. Therefore, before we ask a brick what it wants to be, the conversation must begin with the question, who are you, brick? What is your story? Thank you.
Marina, thank you so much. We're always very nervous when waiting for the lecture of our selected architect, because the idea of the prize is that we should give it to somebody who can articulate practice beyond conventional practice, and they can articulate their ideas and how they work. Not all architects are good at doing that. Not all architects consider architecture in that way. So when we got Marina's fantastic text, it's a great relief to see what a wonderful explanation of architecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's very unusual, I think, to have such a personal insight into a career, and at the same time to be so relevant to explaining how you work. And I think the relevance is not just the way you work, but I think it's clearly a relevance to all of us as architects about the responsibility, the word you used, that we have. We're going to ask Marina some questions. Priya Kamtanchani, who is an editor of, do I say deputy editor of Icon, and a journalist, and Adrian Lahoud, who is the Dean of Architecture at the Royal College of Art, are going to interrogate you on a few points. I would just like to say that I think it's very pertinent at this moment that we see a practitioner like you being responsible. I think you called it enlarging the agenda of architectural engagement. In other words, seeing architecture as something beyond the strict professional responsibility we have as architects. But at the same time, you see an architect with extraordinary professional skills, someone who loves architecture in and of itself, and who is skillful at making architecture, but balanced with an idea of purpose. And I've noticed, and I think it's very interesting how you refer to your Western heroes. I was completely surprised about the New York Five as an influence. We'll skip over that, but obviously Louis Kahn. But I think clearly in the so-called developing world, the attention must have been for many generations, especially in architecture and design, to look to the West, to the so-called developed world. I think it's very interesting in the current situation, and I was editing Domus for a year, and all the practitioners I spoke to, it was very interesting how, in a sense, the architects of the so-called developed world are looking to architects like Marina in the so-called developing world to see practitioners who seem to be engaged in a much more purposeful way than those of us rather over-absorbed in what you refer to correctly as sort of consumerist architecture. And I think that's why you getting this award is so important and inspiring for everybody. I see a few members of the jury here and thank them for making this choice. So, who would like to start? Adrian, do you want to kick off?
Marina and I met in the back of a taxi. I think we were just been to see the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. I remember you told me this incredible story of this spot in the Bengal Delta where grandparents would point into the middle of the river and they would explain to their grandchildren that that's where their property was, and that when the river moved, they should go back and claim it and build their house. And I'd just been asked to curate an exhibition in Sharjah on the theme of rights of future generations, and I thought, okay, this is an incredible story, and I needed to find out more. And you subsequently explained this really remarkable situation of people, building, disassembling, and reassembling their houses around this very dynamic landscape. And I thought it was kind of emblematic for where a lot of us are at, actually, thinking about how to cope with a rapidly changing environment. And so it was the first project we commissioned, and you showed it tonight. But I wanted to maybe ask you to go back to that project a bit, and to ask you what lessons that project and that investigation, which I think is still ongoing, holds for you, and whether there might be lessons for us outside of that context, looking at this really remarkable intergenerational practice of, adapting to this very unstable environment.
Right. Well, as I was mentioning, that the entire the dynamic nature of the deltas, which is actually the active part of the delta. The delta has certain different ways of its formation. There are certain areas which are mature delta, they don't move anymore. But the ones which are more active, which is in the sense that they are still forming and unforming, so basically around that area, it's always movement. There's a lot of movement as the water comes down from the Himalayas, the glacial water, and also we have the monsoon season. During that time, it really inflates. And when it inflates, this is all accumulation of alluvium and silt. So it immediately starts to break. And so this movement is a normal phenomena that has been there for a long, long time. And people are used to it, though this is increasing much more with the climate change and the sea level rise. But at the same time, it has been there. So that's why the vernaculars are very much like that. But interestingly, it was never, all these land that forms in the riverbeds, which are actually sand beds, were never acknowledged as land until the British colonial time, when it was consolidated and turned into land to be able to generate revenue from the locals who were then given as lease. So that's when it actually turned into land, which was not really land. So this whole notion of some parts which are actually belonging to the river turned into this whole understanding of inheritance and land and everything. So that's how it kind of got into human psyche, that my land is inside the river, but it's actually not their land, it's rivers movement. So that's a really interesting thing, and what has happened is now people have these documents which are starting from the British colonial time. Then it used to be lease document, then it was auctioned to the locals, and then they bought it, and then when they bought it, then it became their own land ownership, which is actually water, and then it has been moved on from one generation to the next generation. So the generations basically wait till the land emerges again. So when it emerges, definitely it's not the same shape as it has gone down or they had. So basically what they do is they come and reclaim it, and so there's a lot of dynamics that goes around it. So what I say, or what came about from our research, is that it was an idea of a dry culture that was imposed on the wet culture of Bengal, and that kind of remains the same way. And that was, in a way, our research that came about. But through that research, what happened is that we got engaged with the coastal areas, and because of that reason, then this whole idea of working with the landless people came about, and that's when this whole idea of building these modular houses came into being last year, and now we are building 100 houses in the coastal areas. So one leading to the next. We got a fund from the Swiss government. So yeah, we were able to convince them. Part of it we built because with the Sharjah Triennial, these 3 houses that we bought and took to Sharjah were retained by the Sharjah Triennial, and so they paid us some fund, and with that we actually did the research, and that sort of led us to getting this funding from the Swiss government, and now we are in the process of building.
And you talked about the impact of climate change, and you said at one point I was described as God's will.
Yeah.
I wonder, to what extent can climate change be legible there as climate change in that context?
Yeah.
And also, I guess, how does climate change? How does it materialize for them? Is it more intense rainfall? Is it?
Yeah. So the flooding has increased.
More flooding.
Yeah. So basically, in the coastal areas, we never used to get as much flooding. Flooding is more in the narrower section of the river where it inflates. But in the coastal areas, it's an enormous river. I mean, you need to see the size of our rivers. It's almost like ocean. From one side, you cannot see the other side. So that's the size of a river. And so basically, it's never, flooding has never really happened in the coasts. But nowadays, you see that it's flooding more. The land movement is far more. And so basically, it is very much affecting the people. But they do not realize what is the reason for this. So they think that, it's just, 1 year this will be a bad year, the next year it might be a better year, but it hasn't been the case.
I thought it was really especially beautiful when you talked about the responsibility of people working in the global north in terms of carbon emissions and, the role we play as architects with respect to those kinds of populations as well. I think it's
Right, yeah.
Thanks, Adrian. Hi, Marina. Just to introduce myself again, I'm Priya Kanchandani, and I was at ICON when I interviewed you. I'm now at the Design Museum where I'm head of curatorial. Oh no, I should have kept you up to date. Marina, I had the pleasure of meeting you, I think it was 2018. This is before you'd won the Jamil Prize, when I think the Baitur Rauf project became a lot more well known. Right. I remember seeing this image of it, probably on Instagram, and these amazing kind of shafts of light coming into this dark space. And I remember taking it to my art director and saying, "Can we make a cover from this?" And I remember talking to you about that project, and I had these questions. For example, I wanted to talk to you about, the importance of community, about local context, about materials. But I remember this line that really stood out, and you said to me, "Light is everything." And then you kind of expanded on that in this really amazing way, and that came across today in your lecture when you were talking about the Louis Kahn building and how it inspired you. So what I wanted to ask you was, I think your work is quite very ideologically grounded, hence why I had these questions ready. But you allow architecture to prevail, like the architecture itself. And I wondered, how do you navigate the tension between those two things? And how do you make architecture win?
Yeah, well, I feel that architecture, as I said, that the quintessential agenda of architecture is about space and form. So it needs to elevate anything to the level of architecture, whatever the project may be it a $300 house in a coastal area, or be it a museum of independence. Everything has to reach a certain level where it can be called architecture. So that is something that's a point where I'm never compromising. It doesn't matter what the size, and if it's a community project, if it is built with bamboo or if it's built with concrete, architecture needs to address certain issues. So that's something I think I try to keep focusing on all the time. But it began with very formal kind of architecture that we've been taught, and the way we generally get commissioned, especially in the cities. But as I have started working, especially with the Panigram project, that's the first time I actually went to the villages, and that was my first connection to village, because I never had a village home, being an immigrant from somewhere else. And so that was the first connection that was created, and that's probably the first time I was able to connect with the villagers and to see how wisdom is there in living this whole symbiotic relationship that nature and human exist. And so basically that's where it all started for me. And now we are working in the coastal areas. We are also working, as I was mentioning, with the refugee camps. There is this whole idea of humanistic values that then becomes a part of this extension as an extension to the already existing architectural agendas that I really believe in.
So my next question is really about those ideas and how they are rooted in the present. As a contemporary architect, how do you see yourself against the current landscape of architecture in South Asia? You talked a little bit about the architecture of capital, architecture of consumerism, and the sort of prevailing aspirations regarding architecture in South Asia, which are a counterpoint really to what you are doing. And I remember, there's some echoes in what you say in what Charles Correa used to say. I remember interviewing him kind of many years ago, and him being very unhappy with the situation in his immediate environment in Bombay. And I wondered if you felt the same. How do you deal with this prevailing attitude to architecture in your region?
Yeah, well, there's so much I can do as an architect. I'm really not that big anyway. The fact is the city of Dhaka is crazy.
Ideas are huge.
No, I mean, the city of Dhaka, as you know, I mean, there is the real estate values could be almost compared to Mumbai or even London. It's as expensive to have it's impossible for anybody in the city of Dhaka to be able to claim a small property because the prices are so high. So it is a domain of real estate development, and there are really enormous development going on in terms of the building industry. And so for me, that's since I decided from the very beginning not to go towards that kind of practice or architecture, the projects have become much more fringed on the outskirts of the city. And so the mosque is an outskirt, and then slowly I'm kind of pushed outside. So now I'm in the coastal areas and in the camps, so I'm more in the borders. And I'm kind of happy with that. It's not that I do not enjoy that. And I think that's, to me, far more rewarding in terms of projects where I see the changes in human life. I can be more, contributing far more in terms of environment and building better environment for people. When I talk about architecture of relevance, to me, that is far more relevant of our time than being in the city and designing something, which I definitely enjoy doing. There's no doubt about that. But if it's something that is not coming to me, I'm not going to fight for it.
And how do you balance that in practice? How do you make that balance between?
Balance between the we do have several projects at the moment. We're designing we've just finished designing a hospital, 250-bed hospital, which was a good payment in terms of our fees and everything, so that keeps us going. We have the refugee camp projects, which are, WFP projects or World Food Program. So those are also kind of, I wouldn't say entirely humanitarian, but we are also working as consultants. So I think in terms of practice, as it's a smaller practice, which I kind of decided from the very beginning that I don't want to become too big where I lose the luxury of being able to choose the projects I want to work on, which I think was very consciously decided that I would like to retain my office to a size of 10 to 12 people and not more than that. So that actually helps because we never had to lose anybody during the COVID crisis. Everybody was in the office or working from home, however, but we were able to retain it. And so I think the size of the office, the number of projects that we have actually sustains itself. But what we do is we also have a certain part from our practice that goes into our research. So we have self-initiated researches that we do, like what Adrian was saying. Before we even did the Sharjah Triennial, we were already working on this research. So in a way, that kind of adds to the whole process where I try to combine practice, research, and teaching all together in a way that that then leads to more projects which are self-initiated projects rather than...
But some projects justify the others.
Exactly, exactly, that does. Otherwise, how would I survive?
And that was going to be my point. I mean, I don't know whether you've got another one. Do you want to ask? Yeah.
I mean, I was wondering, given the milestone that today represents, I wondered how you would want to use the platform that you have earned in the future. As an architect, you're still relatively young, and I wondered what does impact look like for you? What is success for you? Because and the context of that question is that maybe a generation ago, an architect of your calibre might have wanted a building, I don't know, in every major metropolis. I don't know, is that your aspiration? If not, what is success for you?
Well, I think someone was asking me in the morning, are you going to go and build places? There's enough work in Bangladesh to keep us busy, actually. I don't think, I really believe that when I go somewhere to do a project, I need to know the place. Context and understanding of the place is very important to me. So just to go there and to build something is not going to happen for me. So I would rather, do whatever I'm doing in Bangladesh. There is, as I said, it's a country which is in the process of developing, and we have about 150 million people. There is enough projects and works that can be done in that country, which is, maybe if I practice another 10 to 20 years is enough to keep me busy.
But do you have to, I think that was a very clear point in a way, because even in your lecture you say at some point your path is somehow defined. I mean, you're still work in progress, but clearly your path defined, and clearly you've confessed a sort of fascination for what you call the fringe projects. Mm-hmm. In order for that to progress, do you have to become more engaged with politics? Do you have to persuade politicians to support you? Because you use the word resistance, right, and the idea that the architect, I think we've all grown up with this idea the architect is a sort of hand of resistance of some sort, right, of fighting. But at some point, we need participation. Exactly. You've talked a lot about participation and engagement with community. Mm-hmm. At some point, presumably, in your situation, you need participation and engagement of decision makers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, I agree. And especially when we are working with the communities, it's important to get the local government interested and to bring them on board. So we work with local government instead of going to the top down. It's mostly a bottom-up process. So in a bottom-up process, it's always better to have the local government and the local, let's say, mayors and even the district commissioners and UNOs to be involved in the process, so that it's a much more sustainable way of working. And in many projects, that's how we work. We get the local government involved in the process, because in many ways, especially if it's a political figure like a mayor, their interest is if there is some sort of a better environment, or if we are building something that adds to their portfolio in a way. So they always try to loop themselves and try to take all the credit, which is fine. They can take all the credit if they like, as long as it improves people's life and living and livelihood. So it's always important to do that. Yeah.
Should we see if there are any questions from the audience?
There's one back.
I see a
First of all, thank you so much for your lecture. It was so inspiring, really wonderful to listen to. And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that recognition of architecture and understanding of it in Bangladesh is fairly low. And I wondered what the implications have been for your practice. I mean, has it made it more difficult to persuade decision makers and power brokers to support you, or has it given you the latitude and freedom to define your practice as you wish, rather than being hamstrung by convention?
Yeah, well, in the city of Dhaka, let's say, or in the larger cities, people have understanding of architecture and architects and how one is employed. And I think architecture has been able to establish itself as a profession, especially in the cities. But cities are only a very small portion of the entire country. But when you go outside of the cities, especially in small towns or even in the villages, nobody knows what architects do, or why would you need to pay someone to design your house? You can do it yourself. So basically that's where we feel that our profession needs to focus on, especially in a country like Bangladesh, because people want to move from, let's say, mud houses to brick houses, but then they don't have the knowledge of building with brick or how to make a proper planning, because the moment you move from a temporary material to a much more permanent material, you need planning. And for that planning, they don't know whom to go to. So basically, it's just a mud house getting transformed into a brick house, which then, lacks all the proper, facilities, or let's say the issues that one needs to deal with. So that's where we feel that we need to focus and tell people who we are, what we can do as professionals. Yes, that's why I find that architects groups, young architects groups, who call themselves community architects, actually, in a large number in Bangladesh, who goes and works with communities. That could be in the slums, or it could be in the villages, who are making really good impact with working with people. So basically, that's where I'm talking about when I talk about the fact that people have less knowledge about architecture or architects as a profession. So it's mostly about not really in the cities. Cities are doing quite fine. If you come to Dhaka, there's beautiful buildings in Dhaka actually, designed by architects. And everybody knows that even if you're doing a small apartment interior, you need an architect. So that's an established profession in the city. But I'm talking more about the outside of the city, where 99% of the population is living.
What's your aspiration for the project, the 2,000 homes that you're building? What do you see in terms of the future of that project entirety?
Right. Yeah. Well, aspiration is that hopefully this can be a part of the vernacular to some extent, because if we can introduce this, and the thing is, it's about accepting. People have to accept. If you want to turn it into a certain kind of a vernacular, where you expect people to, when there is a river erosion, they need to move. And I think the movement will happen a lot now with the climate change. There will be enormous amount of movement. And that's the reason why we think these houses can really help, because bamboos are very cheap. You can just go to some place and cut a few bamboos, and that's good enough for you to make a house. But when you have the steel joints, that's the only thing that you need to carry with you. So when you have that, once we can get that across to people, which is already in the making, so with 100 houses, it's just the very beginning. And so once we are able to get that into the mind of people, The idea is that it could become an open source. We can, then it's almost like what we had as the Grameen housing project in Bangladesh, let's say 20, 30 years ago, where during the flooding, people have lost everything. So this Grameen project, what they did is they just gave 4 columns, which is made out of concrete. So 4 columns and some corrugated sheet. And that was given to women as loan to make houses, basically. And so that really caught on the entire Bangladesh. But at the moment now, I think we've passed that situation, and where now I think it's far more about the coastal areas where people are really facing the problem. So the idea is to keep on building as much as possible, to create communities, and then to see how people actually adapt that into their own vernacular way of living, and then to make it an open source.
Can I ask something else in response to that? So it seems like movement is a big deal in terms of getting the community to understand. But the other aspect is that what's really interesting you were saying is that how when the flooding occurs, people move out, but then they come back. What happens when they're moving out? Where are they? And so there's that movement, but then
that's the
there's
interesting
also
part.
kind of migrating elsewhere. And
So they don't have any place to stay, actually. These are all landless people. So they don't belong anywhere. So they basically move from one chore to another chore. So it's sandbed to sandbed, or wherever it's possible. So it's never fixed, any location. There is no fixed location. It's impossible to fix them anywhere.
And therefore, what are the things that create a community if it's so transient?
Yeah, they generally move. So if it's a movement, generally the entire village moves to a certain location.
And then they move together.
They move together quite often, most of the cases, until and unless somebody decides I've had enough, I want to go to the city and just stay in the slum or something. Yeah.
And why do they stay there? I mean, why do they not migrate to the town city?
I mean, we've asked that while we were doing this research, that why do you stay here? For them it's home. And how? I mean, there is no answer to that. They just tell you it's home.
Eric wants to ask a question.
Well, wonderful, thank you. I'm interested in how your architecture can adapt to something that seems to me very important with community in this sense, and that is a generational change, so that a building might accrue more to sustain an enlarging family, or a family that chooses to inhabit in that proximity because it's home. We have a kind of sense somehow of how we change shell, which is very different. So your architecture, the kind of modules, if you will, how are you thinking with your 100 houses that you would allow them to adapt to that generational growth, if you will?
Yeah, so it's a modular structure. If you want, you can add modules to it. Or quite often the way the generational thing happens is that they start building a few more. So it's kind of expanding a space or territory. So if it's your own land, then of course you can plan. That's how it's generally done. That in the villages, if you have a land, then in terms of inheritance, it gets divided into, let's say, 4 sons, and the 4 sons then 2 among the others. But it's always about creating either division of land or maybe giving each one a house so that they can all live together. So that's when you have land. But when you do not have land, it's when you're just a moving population from one place to another. I think this house, the modular system, is easy because you can just add to that and make it enlarged, or you can have another module just sitting next to it. So it could be a courtyard building up on that. So it shouldn't be that difficult, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thank
Hi.
you for a moving lecture and the journey that you shared. I was really moved by the point you made about wanting to stay in Bangladesh, because certainly in our time, and I think David referred to it, it's the first time we're seeing the West going towards the East and the East not coming, and they usually go towards the East. That said, do you, and putting this award aside, do you think awards a punishment or a reward?
Well, awards are recognition. It's nice to be recognized, knowing that what you're doing has a certain direction which is being appreciated. But that's as much as it does, actually. Your journey is your journey. You do your work. It goes on. So that's. I think it's nice to be recognized, to know that what I'm doing is being appreciated. That appreciation, I think, is really helpful, because it gives you more energy to go forward and do what you do. But what you do is you do. it's that
Did the
cannot
Aga
change.
Khan Award help you in any way?
It helped me with a lot of attention. Whether that was good or not, that I do not know. I had to travel a lot to different places to give talks and whatnot. But in terms of projects, I never really got any project from the Aga Khan Award. I'm sorry to say that. Yeah.
Hi. Neil.
Hi.
I'm just wondering, the first time I heard you talk about the mosque was about 6 years ago,
Right.
and I thought it was the most extraordinary project. And I assumed when I saw that presentation that I would have assumed in 6 years' time that you would have done other extraordinary projects like that. And my question comes to this relationship between form, talent, and virtue. A lot of the way that you're now presenting yourself and being received is as virtuous. And I just think about Louis Kahn when he was doing his early projects, how absolutely insistent he was on the form of or the pure architectonic form of what he was doing. And his drawings rarely even showed context.
Right.
It was just, this is the, and there was a kind of a very deliberate insistence on the pure architectural properties of what he was doing. And I'm just interested in your context. Is there a way that the stories that get told about you, or the stories you begin to tell about yourself, then change the kind of opportunities that you get? Because it seems to me that the work that you showed tonight of the mosque, you talked about it quite quickly in terms of its context and the city and the opportunity and the personal aspect. But as an architect, I'm looking at it thinking, tell me more about that project as a piece of architecture. And I'm just wondering, is there a way in which if you don't project the purely architectural aspects of your work and foreground those, is there a way then that the kinds of opportunities change, or the way in which you're received changes? Is that something that you're aware of?
Well, I don't know really. Well, the mosque, we are designing another mosque, which is kind of not similar, but has a certain background, which probably if it finishes, you'll have a look at that. But the thing is, I feel, especially with the issues that are coming up in terms of climate issues, which I feel is an absolute pressing, especially being in Bangladesh. When you see things on ground, with first-hand experience, then you just cannot think about the space and form only. You need to think perhaps that there is a far more complex issues that needs to be dealt with. And being an architect, it doesn't mean that as architects we cannot expand our agendas and do something more. So I think for me it's always been about relevance, about what can I say, being able to address to the context and time. And I feel like my time and my context requires that there has to be a certain somebody who has that, I wouldn't say knowledge. I'm sure there are many architects much more knowledgeable than me in Bangladesh who can address these issues, but someone whom people listen to, young architects see as a kind of a figure whom they follow in many ways. I feel that I have a far more responsibility in Bangladesh, being an architect from there.
I guess Marina can't go back to Philadelphia. That's the difference. And but I think it's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
Where does it leave architecture in a way? I mean, are we inevitably shifting?
I don't think so.
towards-
I think it's about time's need. You know, it's never. I mean, Louis Kahn's time and my time is not the same. We do not live in the same context. His reality and my reality is quite different, and I need to address my reality. And when I address my reality, perhaps, you know, as much as I would love to build another mosque and, you know, be able to indulge in that process of creativity and to work with that, at the same time I feel that the time requires that I focus much more on the issues that are far more relevant of my time.
Thank you again, like everyone, for a really generous presentation. It was really interesting to hear more about your work. But my question is a variation of the one that just went before, and it's so in the context of what you've described, your architecture is quite self-effacing in service of the kind of the communities it serves and the other aspects of the design process. Do you ever feel a kind of pressure in the way you were just describing to be a kind of to have a kind of aesthetic identity, a formal identity that is about kind of Bangladesh? Because you've spoken quite a lot about place. You've spoken a lot about your biography, which has served, which has kind of informed your work. How does that tension? How do you find that tension in the context of being a kind of preeminent architect of a culture that's not probably understood in that context, in a broader global context, and also in Bangladesh? You must have a lot of pressure to kind of.
Yeah, sure. I mean, of course, there is always a pressure, as Neil was just mentioning, that you expect similar kind of works, and I'm sure there is an enormous amount of pressure from that side. We are working on many other projects also. Today it was 30 minutes of talk and trying to bring everything together. It wasn't really possible to probably share everything that we are working on. So that I'm not completely disregarding that in terms of my practice and architecture, but the fact is that that I really would like to focus on these issues which are important at this point in time, and so that pressure is there, and we do work on these different aspects. It's there in the office. Hopefully, if there is a possibility of sharing another presentation, we could probably share some more projects with you. But I think today it was more about the new issues that are, I wouldn't say new, but much more pressing issues that are there in the landscape, and especially in Bangladesh, which needs to be addressed. And that's why I kind of focused on this more.
I think we've gone. Do we have one more question? One more question.
Thank you so much for your lecture. It was amazing to be able to hear about your life and your work and how you've interwoven it. It's just extremely compelling. I wanted to ask you a question about teaching, and you mentioned that your cohort of students sought to move away, and you made a conscious choice to stay. What is the attitude of the students you're teaching now, and what kind of future do they have for themselves as architects?
I think that movement will always be there. I think it's you cannot help, but a lot of architects I know who got trained in the West comes back to Bangladesh again nowadays. You see a lot of people coming back. And what I feel now, what we see, especially As I was mentioning, that we have these community architects who are so much involved, and especially in our office, we are a small office, but each one of them are hands-on. They know how to build. So as I was mentioning that in Sharjah, there were 3 architects and a carpenter.
Yeah.
4 of them.
Not the other way around.
Yeah. Yes, just 4 of them went there, built the entire 3 houses. And even now, when we are working in the refugee camps, the architects work hands-on. So that's something we have been able to establish, that where it's not just a few drawings or desk-based work, it's all about going on site and holding the material and working with it. I do the same. I expect my my entire team to do the same. So they are all hands-on. And I think that has kind of created this whole new architects where they really enjoy going to site and working with the material that's locally available or whatever is there. So yeah, I think it's a kind of a different way of looking into architecture rather than, you know, with computers and 3D renderings.
I think that's time. Marina, thank you so much. It was a
Thank you.
wonderful lecture.
Thank you, Marina.
Again, and please join us upstairs for reception now.